very warm welcome to our second episode of the Forest Restoration Talks. This is a webinar series which is jointly organized by the Horizon 2020 project Superb, together with the IUFRO Task Force, Transforming Forest Landscape for Future Climates and Human Well-Being. My name is Gesche Schifferdecker. I'm a communications manager with European Forest Institute, and I'm your moderator today. And before digging deeper into the subject of today, which is biodiversity as a key asset for forest restoration in Europe, and before introducing the speakers, I would like to start with some housekeeping rules. This webinar is recorded, and we will make the recording available to watch on the EFI YouTube account as well as on the IUFRO website. And we have the recording of the last webinar already available. My colleague Gabby will share it in the chat. And for questions to Bart Muys, who is our speaker today, you can use the dedicated Q&A box, which you can find in the taskbar of your Zoom. We will, after his presentation, once you put your questions in the chat box, we will promote you to be speakers so that you can ask the questions yourself to make it more interactive, and therefore it would be really important that you also put your video on and are prepared to be seen on the screen. And in case you want to tweet about the webinar, please tag us using both IUFRO and Superb project. You can see the Twitter feeds at the screen. And before we will listen to Bart Muys' speech and learn about biodiversity and the need for biodiversity to restore our forests in Europe, we will get an introduction to the Superb project. Because last time we had the introduction to the IUFRO task force, and this time we will do Superb. And it will be introduced by Elisabeth Pötzelsberger, who's my colleague in Superb, and she's the Superb project coordinator. And Elisabeth, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Gesche. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And now a big welcome also from my side to everyone to the second edition of our new monthly forest restoration webinar series, which, as Gesche has kindly already reminded us, is co-hosted by, on the one hand, this IUFRO task force, Transforming Forest Landscape for Future Climates and Human Well-Being, as it has been last time introduced by Andreas Bolte, who is also here again today, and the Superb project, which is a Green Deal EU-funded Horizon 2020 project, which in its full title is called Systemic Solutions for the Upscaling of Urgent Ecosystem Restoration for Forest-Related Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And it's been really a nice coincidence because basically at the same time, the task force and the Superb project were developing the initial ideas of a forest restoration webinar series. And also interestingly, it's been our first speaker from the first edition, John Stentorf, who basically brought the IUFRO task force and the Superb project together. So I think it was also a great great opportunity to have him last time as our first speaker. And please do check out the recording if you have not been able to participate in last month's webinar. So yeah, today I would like to introduce the project Superb very briefly to you. I will not be sharing slides, but you see the logo in the background of Gesche's and my yeah, background for this video. So Superb is has just celebrated its first birthday. So it started in December 2021, and it's a 4-year Horizon 2020 project with a total funding volume of 20 million euros from the European Commission, so really big forest research project. And what makes it also exceptional is, you know, this additional committed funding resources of about 90 million euros from its around 90 associate partners. So overall, you know, it's really a big project, and we're working with 36 partner organizations, both research organizations and practice organizations, and also SMEs from 16 European countries. So this project has responded to major EU Green Deal ambitions like the restoration of biodiversity or the adaptation of European ecosystems to climate change, also the adaptation of European societies to the challenges of climate change, and also with the vision of making people part of the solution. So the overall goal of the project is to create an enabling environment for and demonstration of large-scale forest landscape restoration across Europe. And where, similarly to FLR, to forest landscape restoration, a term that has been introduced also in the first webinar session, the benefits to the people are really of central importance, and also aiming for multifunctionality of the mainly managed forest ecosystems that we are dealing with, where we try to integrate as much as possible biodiversity restoration into active forest management. Although clearly setting aside and conservation and expansion of the last remaining European primary forests and old growth forests is definitely part of our portfolio. Another important vision in our work is that restoration needs to be forward-looking. So acknowledging the challenges of climate change and also of global change, so new pests and diseases, changing availability of forest labor, new techniques, and so on. And so we are working with adaptive, mostly open-ended restoration trajectories, where typically not a predefined habitat type is really the restoration target, but rather forest functionality and ecosystem resilience. And where our understanding is that often the needs of stopping forest management or going for a vegetation type that may have been, you know, the natural vegetation type in the past, you know, is really not applicable anymore, and would show lower resilience than mixed forests, you know, with more drought-tolerant species that we may mainly be proposing. So we build our vast, superb knowledge on both the practical knowledge on forest restoration in Europe, so forest restoration, sustainable forest management, integrative forest management, and we combine it with existing and also newly developed forest restoration or newly developed scientific knowledge from superb around the topics of biodiversity, forest ecology, silviculture, sustainable finance, forest governance, stakeholder engagement, forest and biodiversity monitoring, and so on. And basically all of these fields we want to also cover in the future in our webinar series, partly with speakers from the Superb project. And for example, we are very, very glad that also Bart Muys is part of our Superb team, but also partly with external speakers. So here I already want to stop again, and I hope I've made you curious to, on the one hand, follow the developments of the Superb project, but also on the other hand, to continue following our monthly restoration forest restoration series. And with that, I'd like to hand back over to Gesche. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. Yes, that was especially the forward-looking part, I think was very crucial, and I think that's also something that Bart will tackle in his presentation. I mean, he will look at the also adaptation component. But first of all, let me introduce him to you. And Gabby, I will do it technically. I will spotlight you, because you deserve the spotlight now. Bart Muys is a professor of forest ecology and forest management at the KU Leuven, and his research focuses on ecosystem functioning of tree diversity, and he also works on ecology of forest restoration and the evaluation of sustainability in forests and also in bioenergy systems. And today he will look with us into what biodiversity is and what it means for forest restoration. And he will also touch upon threats to European forest biodiversity, potential mismatches between forest management and biodiversity, and one of my favorite topics, which is the role of microhabitats. So yeah, we are really much looking forward to your presentation today, which has the promising title, Biodiversity as a Key Asset for Forest Restoration in Europe. And we're looking forward to learning from you now.
Thank you very much, Gesche, for this kind introduction. And also thank you, Elisabeth, for introducing me. Okay, I will try to share my screen. Let's see if that works. Oh, that's not on the right page, but no worry. All right, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. So thank you for inviting me to speak about the relationship between biodiversity and forest restoration today. And yes, as Gesche said, maybe it's important to first know a bit better what biodiversity means. It's a term which is used a lot, but it's in fact quite a new term. It only exists for a few decades. It was like invented as a new word based on the combination of biological diversity, which makes biodiversity. And most people, if we think about biodiversity, they think about species. But of course, species, they also are composed of genetic information, genetic material. So if we go at that lower spatial level, species are composed of genes. But then species, if you have a population of a certain species, this population is part of a larger ecosystem where it lives together with other species, and also in a context of an abiotic situation, a certain climate, a certain soil, and so on. And so the components of biodiversity are these genes, species, and ecosystems, which cover these different scales. But they are what we call composition, and this is only one part of the triangle you see here. And if we have an ecosystem composed of species and species of genes, they will also create structure, because if for example trees emerge in the forest, these trees will have a structure with stems and branches and leaves, and these structures create new habitats for other species. So we will also have to look at the structural diversity in the ecosystem, and that's also biodiversity. And in an ecosystem, every species will have certain functions. Some species, like plants, they can do primary production, photosynthesis, and fix CO2 from the atmosphere and create organic molecules. But then you have others that will just eat these plants, like herbivores, and others that eat herbivores, like carnivores, and so on. So we have different functions in the ecosystem, and so by having more species and more variety in structure, we will also have more functions. We call that functional diversity. So this triangle here now of composition, structural diversity, and functional diversity all together form what we call biodiversity. So as you can imagine, it's a very simple word for a very complex issue. Okay, and what is the role now of biodiversity in forest restoration? Then we also need to look at the definition of forest restoration. And of course, as you know, there are many different definitions. Here is a kind of combined definition which takes the most important elements from other definitions. It says is the practice of repairing and recovering degraded, damaged, or destroyed forests by active human intervention with the purpose of regaining ecosystem structure and function and resulting in a satisfactory flow of ecosystem services. So what we see here in this definition, that is that the purpose is very important. So restoration will also depend on the purpose we give this restoration. And sometimes people want to restore for biodiversity heritage. And in other cases, they want to restore for restoring the productivity of the forest. So depending on the purpose we have, the restoration sometimes will go in completely different directions. And I give a little example here. So sometimes people call restoration the conversion of coppice to high forest, because a coppice is kind of degraded, overexploited system, and by converting it back to high forest, we can restore the productivity of the forest. But other people might do exactly the opposite. Maybe they want to take a high forest and reinstall coppice by just cutting this forest and letting it resprout and starting to manage it as a coppice. And they would do that to recreate a certain heritage where a certain biodiversity is related to. So you can see that depending on the management goal, the restoration goal could be really very different and could be even the completely reverse. And this is a bit what happens at the European level. DG Klima is really promoting forest restoration with the idea of stimulating the mitigation potential of our forests. And in DG Environment, you will find more people that also have in mind to restore forests, but they look more at it from a biodiversity conservation point of view. And very often, this will lead to conflicts, because in some of those cases, you want to increase the biomass in the forest. And in the other case, for more biodiversity, maybe you want to manage more intensively and make the forest more a light-rich environment and just cut more, or even take away the trees to restore the heatland. So that's something you have to remind. The management goal or the restoration goal is very important. Okay, what is now the relation between what is now the relation between restoration and biodiversity? Let's go back to the ecosystem service cascade. And the ecosystem service cascade, that's the relation between ecosystems and the human system. Here in the left, in the green, you have the forest ecosystem. And here in the right, in the red, you have the social system of humans. And both have a certain structure and a certain function. The forest ecosystem has a certain composition, which lead to biophysical structure, and that leads in the end to ecosystem function. And it are mainly these ecosystem functions which will lead to the ecosystem services, the provisioning, the regulating cultural services that will contribute to the structure and function of the social system. The structure, that's what we call the economy, the prosperity, the money. But the money is not a goal on its own. In the end, it wants to create health and well-being. And so that's the function in the social system. And yeah, if the ecosystem services that are flowing to the human system are not satisfactory, humans will have a certain demand on the ecosystem. They will start managing or restoring it. So you see here the forest restoration in red. So that's the arrow back from the human system to the ecosystem. So in fact, restoration is changing the structure and the function of the ecosystem so that the flow of ecosystem services changes or improves and gives a better answer to the demands that human people have. So that's where the restoration is. So where is the biodiversity now? We have it here in green. So biodiversity is part of the structure of this of the system, and so also a goal of the restoration. We want to restore this structure, but biodiversity is also a cultural ecosystem service, because conservation and conservation and management of heritage, that's something that we people like to do because we feel good when we do that. We do the right thing. So it's a cultural service. So biodiversity is both an asset, a part of the structure and function which leads to ecosystem services, but it's also an ecosystem service on its own. So that explains already a bit this relationship between biodiversity and restoration. So the rest of my talk now will focus on this two roles that biodiversity can play in restoration. The first as an asset to help the restoration process by recreating the structure and function. And then the second part will be about biodiversity as a heritage. So rather as a focus or target of restoration. Let's start with the first one. So biodiversity as an asset. And it was already said by Elizabeth, in a context of global change, especially also climate change, we see that the environment is changing quickly, that there are more disturbances, more risks. So restoration, we have to consider it more in a context of building resilience, preparing an ecosystem, increasing its stability so that it can cope with the high uncertainties that are laying in the future. And one important thing about biodiversity, a lot of recent research that learns us that biodiversity has such an important effect on, a positive effect on productivity in ecosystems, on stability, and also on multifunctionality. And I will say a bit more about each of them. So the positive effect of biodiversity on productivity, on stability, and multifunctionality. And the outcomes of this recent research really motivate to promote mixture as an essential restoration tool. So in the past, when we spoke about forest restoration, we did not always think about mixture or diversity. Very often restoration projects were monoculture projects. But in the climate change context, this is no longer a valid option. And this recent paper here of Messier et al. Gives a bit more background on this. First, I would like to show that in many respects, we are passing tipping points, and ecosystems are not functioning the same way anymore as what they used to be. And what you see here in this graph is the outcome of the forest vitality inventory in what we call the ICP Forest Vitality Network. It's a network of plots, forest plots, where vitality is evaluated year by year. And we took the Belgian data here. And so what we see here on the y-axis is the defoliation. So the higher these values, the lower the vitality. And so what you can see over the years here between 1990 and 2015, that overall the vitality of our forests is decreasing and the defoliation is increasing, especially in the last years, which is related to drought incidences. But what is even now more important, that is that if we look in each of these years to the tree diversity in the forests we have evaluated on vitality, so this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is between 1 and 5 species, from monocultures to a very mixed forest, that in this early years in the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s, there was a clear relation where monocultures were more vital than mixtures. But then we have here a number of years in the gray zone where this is like balancing, and then we really have a tipping point. And since 2014, and I can't show you here the data for later, but we know that this trend is continuing, that we have a reversed relationship where the more mixed ones, the ones with 3, 4, 5 species, have a better vitality than the monocultures. So climate change induced what we call a regime shift from performing monocultures in the 1990s to resilient mixtures in the years 2010, 2020. So it shows that biodiversity has become more important than ever before. Let's have a closer look now in restoration projects where we really have planted trees in areas that were degraded or that had no forest before, and see which effect biodiversity had on the vitality, on the productivity, and so on. Let's start with vitality. So here you see the results of the Belgian Phobio experiment. It's a tree diversity experiment where we manipulate the tree diversity in young plantations. And you see that the diversity has no effect on the mean survival outcome. But what has a strong effect is that the diversity, increasing diversity decreases the variance. So the outcome becomes more sure. We can drastically reduce the uncertainty in the outcome. And that's, of course, in restoration projects, a very nice outcome, because it means that in mixed plantations, the risk of failure, and so losing money and being less cost effective, is improving a lot. Let's have a look at a similar experiment, but now in the Mediterranean zone, where drought is even a more important factor of importance. That is the IDENT tree diversity experiment. Is the only tree diversity experiment existing in the Mediterranean zone. It's on Sardinia. And here again, we scored a lot of trees on vitality. And we can see for most species, and especially for all the Mediterranean evergreen trees and shrubs, that there's a clear positive relationship between the functional diversity and the vitality outcome. So it means that in the more diverse plots, if the species are mixed with other species, that the survival becomes better and more sure than in the case that they are growing up in the monocultures. And the reason is that in this Mediterranean zone, microclimate plays an enormous role. And so by mixing, you create microclimates so that species protect each other against drought and drying out, and they start to perform better. So that was some effects of biodiversity on vitality in recent restoration projects. Let's have a look then on productivity. And this results that we see here is from the Fund of Europe. These are not recent plantation sites, but sites with older trees, so more mature forest. And what we see here is a positive effect of species mixture on the yield stability. And the yield stability, you see it here. It's stability over time. So if we have a time series of growth year by year, and we divide the average by the standard deviation, so that's the typical formula used to calculate stability over time. So we call that yield stability. That's also used in agriculture. So we see that this yield stability in most of the cases is increasing a lot with mixtures. So mixed forests remain productive under a wide range of environmental conditions all over Europe. That's what we learn here. This is another example, specifically from the forest of Białowieża. You know, this is one of the only lowland natural forests in Europe, in the east of Poland. And there we used satellite remote sensing to look at the productivity. And yeah, we used the NDVI as an indicator. Well, it's the EVI here, the Advanced Vegetation Index, nearly the same. And what we see here that all the years that we have looked at the satellite series, that the spatial variance in growth performance is the highest in the monocultures, and again that in the mixtures the outcome, so the variance, the spatial variance, is the lowest. So also here we see an example that diversity is stabilizing the system, and that you get an outcome which is less uncertain and more sure. So using mixture is decreasing your risks. So we can say productivity is more variable and more uncertain in monocultures compared to mixtures. And another thing that is that mixtures also have an effect on the associated biodiversity. And then we don't look at the trees anymore, but at all the rest. And these are also data from the Fund of Europe, where in this plots with different diversity levels, we did not only measure the trees, but also lots of other organisms like birds and bats and microorganisms and earthworms and so on and so forth. And so you can see that there's quite a positive effect of mixture for most of this forest associated taxa in European forests. So it means that if you restore mixed forest, you can expect higher levels of associated biodiversity by doing this compared to restoring with monocultures. So you see here the species richness, functional dispersion play an important role together with environmental factors. And then the last but also very important effect of biodiversity in restoration projects, and something that Elisabeth already mentioned before, is the multifunctionality. Because different species have different traits, they will also contribute to the multifunctionality of the overall system. And here you can see at the left a theoretical example, which shows what multifunctionality really means. And then here to the right, you see the result from the real forest. So imagine a monoculture number one. We consider like 4 ecosystem functions, one related to water, one to maybe recreation, another one to wood production, and another one to biodiversity. You see that this first species here is a master of here ecosystem function 2 recreation and 4 biodiversity, but scores quite low for these other 2 services. So yeah, if we put a multifunction, if we consider a function as fulfilled when they can reach a level 5, then we have a multifunctionality of 2. The same for the monoculture 2 here, which might have strengths in the other functions, like here very good for water and for wood production, but less for recreation and biodiversity. So again here the multifunctionality is quite low. So if we mix those 2 species now, the ecosystem function score of all the 4 functions now comes at the level of 6, because we take the average of the 2 here and the 10 there, and we come to the 6. And so all of them are above the threshold of 5. So our multifunctionality becomes 4 now. So it shows by mixing, we can increase the multifunctionality of a forest. And so in the Fund of Europe plots, we have then looked at all this function of different tree species and looked at the mixture, and we could also clearly see that when the species richness increases, also the multifunctionality in this forest increases. So that was called a jack of all trade and a master of none effect. So that's what mixed forests are. They are maybe not the specialists because they are not monoculture, but because they are with many species, each with their own strengths, they create a kind of jack of all trade system that is quite good at some level in all the functions. And that's now the idea. Modern restoration will look in the landscape where the different tree species are and which traits they have, and we'll try to create a functional network. So we will look in the space if all the functions are everywhere in the landscape. And if they are not, we will do very targeted plantations with very targeted species to make sure that the mixtures become more multifunctional, that we have all the traits that we need in a stable, healthy forest to create more stable forest landscapes. So forest landscape restoration becomes a restoration of this functional network. One thing I would like to add here is the whole idea about assisted migration. As you know, with climate change, many of the native tree species we have in certain area might not be adapted anymore to the new climatic conditions that we have. And it might also take a while before the species can arrive there on their own, because migration patterns depend on dispersal processes, and that can go very slow, especially in the fragmented landscapes that we have in Europe. So the idea is now that in the future we might use assisted migration. So we help species to overcome this migration filter, or this migration inertia. And the idea is that we should not only speak about tree species. If we think about assisted migration nowadays, we think about bringing species like Cetus atlantica, maybe from Morocco, to parts of Atlantic Europe. But we should more think about ecosystems, or co-evolved groups of organisms. An interesting concept is that of the total dispersal kernel. You can look at all the species and also all the processes that are needed for a species, for example, a tree species, to disperse, to migrate. And so you should take into account that all these elements can also move and come to a new place. So you would need some of those processes, some of this species, and so on. And even we don't have to limit to the dispersal kernel, but probably also to what is needed after a species is dispersed. Because a seed can arrive somewhere on a new place, but then the seed must germinate, must survive, and must become a mature tree. So this very critical parts of the life cycle of a tree, which is the young stage, the seedling, sapling stage, needs very particular conditions, and very often they are dependent on mycorrhiza or other microorganisms. So probably in the future we need to think about what we call co-migration or assisted co-migration, where we do not only help the trees to move into a new area, but also help the other elements in the ecosystem which belong together with the tree, like the mycorrhizal or the saprotrophs, which are able to decompose the leaves, etc., etc. The earthworms, which can stimulate a little decomposition, and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have too much experience with that. So more experiments, more controlled experiments are certainly needed to know more about these opportunities. I think this is enough now for this first part on biodiversity as an asset. Let's go now to the second, smaller part, which is about biodiversity as a heritage. And so here the idea is that we would restore ecosystems, forest ecosystems, specifically to create or recreate or restore the heritage value of the biodiversity. And yeah, to understand what can be done, we should have a look at what is important for biodiversity heritage in European forests. And this is not everywhere the same. there is clear context dependency, and in certain areas more to the east of Europe, you will find still more even primary forests in some parts of Scandinavia and south Eastern Europe, like Romania, Ukraine. Old growth forests, so forests with old trees, which is not necessarily primary, it can have been managed or managed in the past. But the more we move to the west of the continent, the higher the human population has been through time, and the more forests have been deforested or fragmented. And in those areas, a kind of new equilibrium has found its place between the management and the biodiversity, and the result has been what we call cultural landscapes. Very often these cultural landscapes are non-forest landscapes, but which still have trees, like maquis or dehesas or heathlands. It can also be fragments of what we call ancient forest. And attention, ancient forest is not exactly the same as primary forest or old growth forest. In ancient forest, very often the trees are young or managed or harvested and so on. But the forest floor, the forest soil is ancient. It means that it has never been deforested or plowed or used as agriculture. And there's very specific biodiversity of plants and insects and fungi that belong to this ancient forest. Old growth forests are forests with old trees. They are not necessarily ancient, but they can also be ancient. So old growth means old trees with a lot of dead wood and so on. Ancient means old soils. And so I would say the ideal combination of ancient and old growth, that's what we would call primary. Okay, so now we understand a bit better where the biodiversity heritage is that we have to try to protect or restore. It's also important to know what are the threats to this biodiversity. And in Europe, a very important one is the atmospheric pollution, which has acidified and eutrophied a lot of the forest ecosystems all over the place, and which is a bit a forgotten but not solved issue. There is less atmospheric pollution, but there's still too high nitrogen pollution in many parts of Europe, and also acidic depositions are still there. Then the land use change may be less an issue. And the deforestation in Europe is more or less under control, but an issue can be just the other way around. There's a lot of land abandonment, so that non-forested areas become forested, which might also be an issue for biodiversity loss of open areas. Then we have the climate change, where we spoke already about. We have the biological invasions, which can compete with native species. And we have also what we call the internal threats by forest management. Many of you might be forest managers, and forest management can do a lot of good for biodiversity and ecosystem services, but not always. And we need to be aware of that and recognize that forest management, depending on what it exactly does, can be harmful or beneficial for biodiversity. And here you see some of the elements forest management that play a role: conversion from ancient broadleafed coppice forest to spruce plantation, for example, harvesting over harvesting, species choice, removal of habitat trees, very old trees, dead wood, stumps, site improvement, fertilizers, biocide use, all things that also have been used in restoration projects in the past, might have a negative effect on biodiversity as a heritage. And what is very often the problem, that is that there's a kind of mismatch between the typical stage in the succession where managed forests are, and then the stages where the biodiversity becomes very high. And you see this mismatch between the red area, which are typically the managed forests, and they are this kind of mid-age forest stands, which are in forest managed with a rotation length maybe of between 50 and 100 years, so they stay always somewhere in this phase. And then the phase where for example in primary forest or in old growth forest, we find a lot of biodiversity in this very old and degrading stages of decay, because there's a lot of dead wood, there's a lot of structural diversity and so on. And so that's a clear mismatch. So if we want to decrease this mismatch, we need to try to make forests either older by increasing the rotation length, or by keeping some of these old elements when we regenerate the forest, so that in this younger forest we still have some of these elements of this older forests. So there's different ways of trying to merge this interest between production and biodiversity. What we can remind here that is that forestry overall is less intensive than agriculture. Very often there's no fertilizers, there's no biocides, so very little. But even in close to nature forests, we might lack some of the development stages, like this very old stages, or also gaps, like permanent gaps. And Gesche said that she liked a lot of the microhabitats. So here they are. And microhabitats, or habitats which are created thanks to the structures we have in all trees, dead trees, standing and lying. And here in this picture you see a few of these different microhabitats that can be the consequence of having old trees, like this hollows, places for woodpeckers and other birds to have their nests. There's also this dendrothelms where water is permanently standing, where we can have even organisms of aquatic ecosystems. There's also a whole succession in this degrading dead wood. It can go from boreholes, from carabid beetles, then earthworms coming under the bark, then mushrooms, which will help to decay the wood. So there's a huge diversity related to this old and dead trees. And so if they are completely absent in our forests, we will miss this biodiversity. An important message that I want to pass here, that is that biodiversity as a heritage is easy to recreate in any forest. So whatever restoration project you have, and whatever your restoration goal might be, even a quite strong production goal, there are simple things to do that can increase the biodiversity heritage value. And here you see a few of these ideas. You can introduce more mixture. After disturbance, maybe you don't have to clean up everything and leave some of this degraded stages as gaps, or old and dead standing trees, not removing all the dead wood, having an eye for microhabitats. So if you do a thinning in your forest, normally you will promote the high quality trees for the timber, but every now and then you can also save a landscape tree, which over the long term will become a habitat tree, which will have a lot of biodiversity. So not only having timber quality as a thinning criterion, but also biodiversity is very simple to do. Then the habitat trees, trying to conserve the genetic variation in your stand, also within the populations of single trees, and of course having an eye for rare biotopes and not destroying them with the machinery and so on. And of course, if we do a restoration project, we need to understand what is the effect of that restoration. We always need to learn, does our restoration has the expected outcome in terms of the ecosystem services we had in mind, but also in terms of the biodiversity. And well, yeah, here you see in this graph some of the ideas that we can have in biodiversity monitoring. And you know, classical forest monitoring is mainly just monitoring the growth of the trees by measuring the diameter, maybe the height of trees. But we can do so much more things in permanent plots. And you see here some of these ideas. There's a lot of possibilities with new technologies like using drones to have the 3D structural or structure of the canopy. We can have sound recorders to know how much birds and so on are active. We can have camera traps to see if we have big wild mammals, pitfall trapping for carroted beetles or spiders, etc. Very promising is also the eDNA. It's still expensive, but we can just sample soil or air from our system and have a complete overview of all the species that are somewhere in our system. The LiDAR for the structure. And very important is also the citizen science. As a restoration manager, we don't have all that knowledge in hand, also not the time for all this monitoring, but we can really increase our monitoring capacity by involving local volunteers. There's so much people around that are interested in biodiversity, that want to learn more, and they can use these apps that nowadays exist that help with artificial intelligence to identify species just by uploading a photo. And yeah, some of the volunteers are better experts than the professors at the university. So taking this citizen science serious and using it actively in our restoration sites is really something that we have to work out in the future. And biodiversity is fun, so we should really promote it as a kind of hobby to observe and upload species. Okay, we are almost to the end of this presentation. I would like to give you a few take-home messages. The first one is that restoration can have several goals. And so depending on this restoration goal, restoration can go very different ways. It's important to know, and we have to really well define that goal before we start with our restoration works. But anyway, whatever restoration goal we have, biodiversity is always a key asset for restoration efforts. And as said, in the context of climate change, it is more important than ever that we will create mixed, high diversity, no regrets restoration system or restored systems. The third idea is that tree species mixture is so important, and we can do that by having an eye for maximum functional diversity. So not just mixing tree species in a random way, but having an eye for the different functions they have in the ecosystem and also the different ecosystem services they could support. And this is really the best no regret tool for any forest restoration effort. A fourth idea is that assisted migration might become more important in the future, and especially this multi-taxa migration, and because trees should not be moved isolated. They go together with many associated species that belong with them and that can support them to become a success. The fifth idea is that forest restoration, whatever its goal, can easily take heritage values on board. So whatever forest you have, whatever forest management goal, take some simple efforts on board to increase the biodiversity in your forest. Very often it will not go at the expense of these other goals like wood production or timber quality timber production. Very often these things go quite well together. And the sixth and last one is, as a restoration manager, experiment. Try different alternatives and always monitor to learn from your experiments. Because without monitoring, we never know what we are doing and we can't learn from our mistakes in the past. As a last thing, I would like to make a bit of publicity for the new EFI report from Science to Policy, which is about forest biodiversity in Europe, and which has been used as a source of inspiration for this talk today. And so you can freely find it on the web under this DOI. I guess my presentation will also be shared afterwards, so you can have a closer look later on. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bart. Also for the take-home messages, which I always find very useful to summarize a presentation and to also have an idea what we can do in our everyday work. And I have already a couple of questions, but of course our attendees of the webinar come first. And I would like to ask Andrew, whom I just, yes, I can see you. I just promoted you to become a panelist, so please ask your question live, Andrew. You're muted.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Now we
Thank
can.
you for this. I want to ask, is there any method to introduce microbiomes from ancient forests, which you've just explained to me in detail, to us in detail what it is, when we're populating areas with trees, because these diverse microbiomes were sometimes lost after felling down an area of woodland. Could the microbiomes be reintroduced along with saplings in the container they're planted in, when they're planted in the soil? Could we reintroduce microbiomes by seeding them?
Yeah, the quality of the sound is not very good. So
Oh, sorry.
The question is if we could transplant microbiomes together with the seedlings of the trees. Of course, yeah. If we cultivate trees in a nursery and plant them with bare roots, nothing will come along. So it might be one reason to use these container plants, which come with a bit of soil. But maybe more promising is to take seedlings from natural forests, natural seedlings, and transplant them so that we could also move with them the whole microbiome that they had in the existing forest. So that would be kind of new nursery practice where we use the material that the trees had in their original forest. The question is then, do they still pass the nursery to further let them grow up, or should we transplant them directly? But that's I would say, a technical matter that can be solved.
Thank you. I had one other question. May I ask it? A quick one.
Yes, go ahead.
A quick one. Yes.
Can we plan ahead for creating ecological climates by pre-assembling biotopes?
Yeah, the sound is really not very good. So could you repeat?
Oh, can we plan ahead for ecological climates in forests by pre-assembling biotopes?
I'm not sure by.
Never mind.
I think it is the best to put it in the chat.
You can put it in chat. The sound is really not good. I apologize for that.
I think it's already there, that question. Can we reforest with ecological climax in mind by pre-assembling biotopes? I think was the question.
By pre-assembling biotopes. Yeah, I'm not sure how I have to interpret that. Pre-assembling biotopes.
I would recommend that we continue because there are further questions, and maybe we can get back to that later on. Gabby, I have a request for you. Please, after promoting the panelists, after promoting the attendees to panelists, please also de-promote them back to participants. Otherwise, the screen gets a little bit messy. So thank you very much. Our next question comes from Evangelia, and please, Evangelia, please also shortly introduce yourself and then ask your question to Bart.
Hi,
Hi,
I'm Evangelia Avramidou. I'm from Greece, and I would like to ask something simple, but I would like to get it clear. How do you measure vitality? Because you said when you have a mixed forest, you observe that vitality is better. In relation to what do you measure vitality, and with what indicators?
Well, as you know, there's this vitality network all over Europe, and they have a standardized protocol to measure vitality. In fact, they look at leaf loss and leaf discoloration. So
Okay.
they have a kind of reference leaf density for a healthy tree in a certain area and a certain species, and the same for the color. And so by using binoculars every year in the same moment, they will try to evaluate. In this plantations, we have used protocols which are a bit more detailed, so to say.
Okay.
You can go as far as you want. You can measure chlorophyll concentrations in the leaves and so on and so forth. But this is the most simple way, just to look at the leaf discoloration and the leaf fall.
Okay, thank you.
If there's no question at the moment there's actually one question from Andreas. Yes, we cannot use the Q&A, but you can approach me. So I invite you to ask your question, and then maybe I can ask my question later on.
Yeah, thank you, Gesche, and thank you, Bart, for this really excellent talk. I have one question concerning the role of forest management in terms of preserving or conserving and developing biodiversity, because I have the impression that often more or less natural dynamics and natural development is seen as a main driver for increasing biodiversity. But on the other side, we see that we have also some dominant forest ecosystem, which has, if you come from the tree species, diversity are not very rich. So the question is, how do you see that the role of forest management, for example, by increasing diversity, increasing forestry species numbers, but also structures? Because perhaps one example in Germany or Central Europe, we know that this traditional system of standard copies with standards, Mittelwald, has often the highest biodiversity, but this is of course a highly artificial system compared to natural dynamics and natural forests.
Yeah, indeed, that's a very good remark. That's also why I made clear that heritage can lay in natural forest and managed forest, but heritage can also lay, biodiversity heritage can also lay in managed forest. And I think this copies with standards is a very good example of, in fact, a quite intensively managed forest with a long management history, which has been executed for sometimes hundreds of years, which has led to a biodiversity which is in equilibrium, in harmony with the system. And the recurrent cuttings in this copies or copies with standards make that not only the very shade tolerant plant and tree species of more dense natural forests will survive, but also typical species that you will find in forest gaps or in the edges of forests or even in the agricultural landscape. And the biodiversity value of those species can be very high, because in the agricultural landscape, those species don't find a place anymore because everything is over fertilized and so on. So I think we have a responsibility there to also maintain and manage the heritage of this managed systems. And I think we have to analyze the potential that we have there. So that's why I think in Western Europe very often we have this ancient forest, we have this copper systems and so on. So very often there it makes a lot of sense to manage, to continue the management and to invest in such management to keep that biodiversity. While in areas where you still have primary forest or old growth or things that still have old growth features, to go back to that old growth. So the potential is very often there, and based on that potential we should take a decision on where we lead the decision of management or non-management. We have a paper published in Bioscience 2018, I think, which explains a bit this idea that rather than starting from our preferences or certain beliefs, we should really look at the legacies that are there, and these legacies determine, let's say, the biodiversity potential that can help us in deciding if we should go to a managed or an unmanaged system for biodiversity conservation.
Thank you very much, Bart. And I've just heard that Elisabeth has a follow-up question. So we'll have Elisabeth and then we'll have Pedro Passaro.
Thank you very much also for allowing me to ask my question. And first of all, congratulations, Bart, to this really, really excellent talk. So now, indeed, following up on Andreas's question, because I was also wondering about the role of disturbances, both natural as well as, human-induced disturbances in creating a certain level or a certain type of biodiversity. I think you briefly touched upon it in the section on biodiversity as a heritage, but also when you mentioned it as one of the measures that could promote biodiversity in any forest management unit. So how about the issue of scale here, and what is really the option, for a, say, small forest owner in comparison to, what might be a natural disturbance regime on much larger areas? So how do you see it practically? And as said, what is the issue of scale to work here actively with disturbance management?
Yeah, thank you, Elisabeth. Yeah, and I decided in this talk not to talk too much about management at the landscape scale, to not overload it, but in the biodiversity report, there's much more about that. So at the landscape scale, we can of course do much more things, and we can have certain areas where we decide to not manage, and then to have other areas where we manage. Or alternatively, we can have the whole landscape in a kind of multifunctional approach, where we try to balance between management that would produce wood, but takes on board some level of biodiversity protection as well. And both of these options, we call that land sparing, and there's a complete spatial separation of the conservation zones and the management zones for other ecosystem services, or the land sharing, and that's more the multifunctional approach, where we try to integrate biodiversity into the normal management. Both options are interesting. But again, there we have to start from the legacies. In a country like Germany, that has, where the forests have been managed for a long time, probably the multifunctional option is a very interesting one, because we have these managed forests that still have some biodiversity values. So it's an option that starts already from a heritage that is there, and we can conserve it. While in areas where we have still large, more or less untouched areas, we should not put those ones into multifunctional forest management. We should do a large effort to conserve them and to have really a priority conservation status for them. So I think it really depends on the situation and on the potential. And it's of course the debate becomes very hot if you start to put percentages on it. So how much percentage of the land should be managed or unmanaged? And this is a very hot debate at this time, where foresters tend to say, yeah, there's sufficient conservation land. We need also wood for the circular bioeconomy. We need to get rid of the fossil fuels, and we will need this wood. And then a more conservationist point of view that say, oh, no, okay, 30-50% of all the forest in Europe should be unmanaged. And I think neither of these options is good. And I think there's a third way necessary, as said, where we really start from the opportunities we have in areas. And as you said, in areas where we have a lot of small owners, it will be difficult to say, okay, now we will create a big unmanaged area in here. Yeah, then you will need to buy that land or give a lot of subsidy to those people to give them a decent income to compensate for the loss in production they have. So depending on the situation, we can choose between options of land sharing and land sparing. And in areas with a lot of smallholder forest managers, it's much better to just invest in this integrative forest management and try on every single stand to increase the biodiversity by convincing those people that mixed forests are better than monocultures, and having some dead wood around can make a lot of difference.
Thank you very much, Bart, also for this pragmatic approach, which I always find very helpful, because there are trade-offs indeed when it comes to, not just when it comes to wood production and biodiversity, but also when it comes to other ecosystem functions. And it is important to also mention them and discuss them. We have a question from Pedro. Please briefly introduce yourself, and then we take it from there.
Hello, my name is Pedro Pássaro. I'm a forestry student in my master's, and my question is more about the definitions. We were talking a lot about biodiversity, but that usually means species richness. And then my question was related to that, how the results that were shown in the presentation can be used in a more general terms, because we saw species richness from 1 to 5, and well, I think that's not representative for a natural forests. And yeah, and if the increase in productivity was mostly continuous with increasing biodiversity, say 10, 12, 25 species, or if we see a plateau after a while. Yeah, that's were my main questions. Thank you.
Yeah, a very clear and important question. Yes, of course, in these experiments, we need to simplify, and very often most experiments have a species gradient between 1 and 4, 1 and 5. Indeed, in natural forests, sometimes the species diversity can be higher, although in most natural forests in Europe, the species diversity is not that high. Yeah? We don't have this very rich systems, at least not in tree diversity. But there are other experiments, like in subtropical China, where the diversity of the natural forest is also much higher, and where the experiments manipulate plots up to 25 or more species. And let's say most of this research shows the same pattern. That is that there is a fast increase in productivity or stability or any of these other ecosystem functions with increasing diversity from monoculture to 2, 3, 4, and 5, and so on. It increases very fast, and then it goes quite fast to a asymptotic, to a plateau, like you said. So that means that if you have a lot of species, there's a lot of redundancy. So the other way around, if you would take out species from a very mixed system, in the beginning, in terms of functionality, not much will happen. But of course, if you start to take away key functions, then the whole system changes and will eventually collapse or get a problem. So there's I haven't shown it now. There's a paper which makes a synthesis of all these diversity experiments, even not only in forest, but also in grasslands and in aquatic systems and so on. And they all show this same pattern with this asymptotic behavior. So yeah, if you have an ecosystem with a lot of species, very often in functional terms, that does not make so much difference with one with a few species. But if you go beyond or below a few species, then the big changes start.
Thank you very much, Bart, and also Pedro, for your question. Actually, before inviting Dennis Popov to speak, there is a question regarding assisted migration, which is coming from Andreas. So Andreas, maybe you want to ask the question yourself, and then we can follow up with Dennis afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Kesha. But my question refers to, I think, the very interesting ideas of looking on assisted migration, not on the species level or tree species level, but also on the entire biosynosis level. But I wonder a bit, how can you do it in practice? Because you have perhaps hundreds, thousands of perhaps taxa within an ecosystem. So could you recommend how we can step from a, I think, simple tree species approach to a more or less ecosystem approach with assisted migration?
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. I think the first important step is what Christian Messier in Quebec is now trying to do with his functional networks. So look at the assisted migration not as a matter of choosing individual new species, but rather to look at bringing in functions and assuring that functions that we are losing now by species which are not adapted anymore, that they are replaced by species or groups of species that can replace that functions, and that create also a certain redundancy in those functions. So bringing in groups of species, I think, is already really a big way forward, and not just a random group of species, but species that have functional roles where we thought about. Then, of course, the co-migration with the whole, that's of course another story, and I think in the near future the eDNA will help us a lot. I think we can take out seedlings with a bit of soil. We can detect what is in there. We can compare it with what we have in the restoration site, and probably we will find ways to do that. Because there's also an ethical thing. If you start not only to introduce tree species, you introduce tens or hundreds of new species of microbes, insects, mites, collembola, whatever. You don't have any clue anymore what you're doing. So it needs some further thinking, also from that point of view. What is acceptable, also in terms of conservation of heritage, and what are the rules and the do's and the don'ts.
May I have just one additional short question? Is I completely can follow this. But I think one risk, because migration itself is a filter, that means we do not know if we more or less mimic the natural migration, if the same habitats would be occur on another place after the migration processes. So, and that is also the idea of so-called neo-native ecosystem, which will more or less develop due to climate change driven migration. So this is perhaps also one thing that we just more or less restore, you know, the past system from another place in a target place. So I think this should be also included in this discussion, that there might be also a development of the ecosystem or the types due to climate change driven migration.
Yeah, I very much agree. Eh? So we get completely new systems that did not exist before, and the other thing is it's a moving target. We speak now about a system under a scenario of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, but that's a certain reference in time, in 50 or in 100 years. But this is not. People think now that this will it will get warmer and then it will stop after 50 years and come on a plateau. No, it's not like that. There's a whole curve. It can increase and then later decrease again, and so it's a moving target. So that's why I like quite the approach that is developed now for the selection of provenances by Biodiversity International. They developed a model which is not prepared for Europe yet, but it works for South America. It's about what we call climate smart provenancing, where you can combine different strategies. For example, you have a whole gradient. So the climate of Brussels in the future can be the climate maybe of Paris of today, but it could also be Clermont-Ferrand. So from your oak provenances, you could either select the Clermont-Ferrand provenance and start to mix it in the autochthonous populations of Belgium. But you could also consider that we don't know exactly what will be the future climate, so we start to mix provenances from different southern locations of different distance. We don't take them only from the south or the southwest, because there can be a frost danger. We could also start to mix from the southwest and southeast and even the east, because eastern provenances will also be prepared in hotter summers maybe. So there's different strategies possible, and also models that allow to explore what happens if you do this or that. And yeah, partly it will be learning by doing, but we always need to monitor to see what is the outcome of what we are doing.
Thank you very much, Bart, also for again highlighting the importance of monitoring, which also helps us to then learn from what has happened in the past, and to adapt also our approaches. There is a question from Dennis, and I have another question from Simon Fleckenstein, which will still be asked, and before we then wrap up the webinar. But Dennis, now you have the floor.
Colleagues, good evening. So my question is maybe a little bit off topic, but so the question is that as a forester, I'm keen on context-specific methodologies and metrics to measure biodiversity. From another side, having also task to promote forest products like paper and packaging, so I am also kind of monitoring this landscape of different magic or simple metrics, and I came across and more often see metrics like MSA, mean species abundance, and PDF, potentially dissipate fracture, and it looks like it is gaining more and more popularity. The question will be, what do you think from scientific perspective? Is this metric anyhow helpful? Is it promising, and are there any chances to make sure that all complexity and granularity can be linked effectively to some simple metrics? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis. Again, a very important question, and I think it becomes very important if we want to say something about the environmental quality of a wood product, like a paper product that Mondi is probably producing. So I'm a bit reluctant for this single indicators which would tell us everything, and we have been quite involved in trying to find indicator baskets that can be directly used in life cycle assessment, because that's what we want to do. If we want to compare the environmental quality of a product, a life cycle assessment is often the best methodology. And so these biodiversity issues, they make part of the land use impact in LCA, and unfortunately there is no ISO standardized way of measuring this land use impact. And then very often in standard LCAs, they just look at the amount of land that has been used to produce a certain amount of wood. We propose, and there's a paper by Peter Freer-Smith et al. From this year, this land use impact method, which is able to compare any forest management in any forest type worldwide. And the indicators, it's indicated baskets. It's like 14 indicators, and it evaluates the land use impact on soil, on water, on vegetation, and on biodiversity. And yeah, the problem with biodiversity is that there's so much taxa, and as you say, it's very context dependent, and yeah, some species are rare, others are difficult to see, and so on. So methodologically, it's a nightmare. So what we propose for biodiversity is what we call midpoint indicators. We don't measure the response of the biodiversity itself, which is too costly and too complex, but we measure the intervention which leads to a biodiversity degradation. And this is based on relationships we know from the literature. For example, if we know in a forest ecosystem how often and how much it is fertilized, or biocides are used, or which percentage of the canopy is composed of exotic species compared to native species. I just give a few examples, but this simple metrics gave a quite good idea and also a balanced, broad idea about yeah, what is the distance from the naturalness in a system. And well, even 20 years ago, we experimented with this method in South Africa in different plantation forestry and natural forest areas, and it seems to work quite well.
Thank you very much, Bart.
You can send me an email if you want this paper. I can send you.
Great. So you can follow up on that. I would still like to allow Simon Fleckenstein to ask his question, which is related to forest resilience. And I think very good question to also wrap up the discussion, because yeah, that's the ultimate aim, or one of the ultimate aims, also to increase the resilience of our forests, to maintain them for future generations. So Simon, you have the floor.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much also from my side for this very interesting talk. And as Gesche already mentioned, I have a question related to the indicator monitoring of forest biodiversity restoration. So in your opinion, or what is your recommendation on what indicators or criteria should we actually focus on when aiming at monitoring or considering the restoration of biodiversity as an asset, with explicit focus on resilience, on the adaptive capacity of forests, but also on the multifunctionality? Or to somewhat put it differently, where should forest policy or forest management focus on when trying to increase the stability and the multifunctionality of forest? What would be the main criteria in your opinion?
Yeah, I think the main criteria here would be to calculate this functional diversity that you have in your forest. So you would need a matrix with the different tree species you have, and for every species the different traits or functions they have, and based on that, for several places in your landscape, before and after restoration, you can monitor this functional diversity and see if this is under control, stable, increasing or decreasing. I think it's pretty easy to do, and I refer to this paper by the group of Messier about this functional networks. It's Aquilé, Nuria Aquilé et al. Yeah, it's in the presentation. So if you wouldn't find it, you can also contact me.
Great, thank you very much.
Wonderful. I've just shared a blog post by Marco Mina, who is a colleague of Christian Messier,
Yeah, right.
who's involved in this paper, in the chat. So you can look it up. It's a very nice summary of their work, actually, especially this paper you're referring to. So I can very much recommend that one. It's time for me to wrap it up now. Well, we've learned that biodiversity has become more important than ever before, and that we need to see forest ecosystems as complex systems, and we need to consider definitely for biodiversity more factors than just tree species diversity, but also other elements of the ecosystem like biodiversity in the soil, etc. In the soil, I mean also in the soul, but that's a different story. And we've learned also about threats of biodiversity and how we can actually tackle them. We emphasize the need for biodiversity monitoring. Also really much like that you said, we need to take citizen science serious. I'm also using one of these apps, so I think it's very, very helpful to learn and also to really also use the knowledge of the and the passion of regular citizens who walk in the forest and have an interest. And I couldn't ask my question now, but that's fine. I will ask it another time. I would very much again recommend the comprehensive study that Bart and a team of high-profile researchers conducted on biodiversity in the EU. I think we can still share the link in the chat or share it with the participants when attached to the video that we will share in a couple of weeks before the next webinar, actually, which will take place on the 11th of January 2023. And it will be, our speaker will be Markus Höhl from ZUG Germany, and he will discuss forest landscape restoration and local community involvement. He will discuss how we can deliver the promises to succeed in restoration through this local community involvement. So there's a lot you can look forward to. I want to thank you all for your active participation. Yeah, Gabriela just shared the link also to the upcoming webinars. Thank you very much, Bart. Again, it's always great to listen to you because you're this amazing source of knowledge. So I think we could all continue to listening, but we'll for sure have you in other talks. So there's a lot to follow up upon. And I wish you a wonderful Christmas break to everyone. And then we will reunite hopefully on the 11th of January next year. Thank you very much.